Hi, in this film I'm going to explain John Stuart Mill's version of utilitarian ethics. And I'm going to try and explain how we can describe it as a eudaimonistic, weak rule utilitarianism, with those three key concepts within it. But as we look at Mill, what we discover is that during the writing of his essay, he seems to move closer to an Aristotelian position. In other words, he's influenced by the Greek view of happiness, which means that he embraces really the concepts underlying eudaimonia, the Greek word for happiness or fulfillment or the flourishing life. And he's, in a sense, responding to criticisms by people like Thomas Carlyle at the time of Bentham's version of utilitarianism. And particularly, perhaps we can think of three. Firstly, that Bentham's was a swinish philosophy, because it seemed to suggest that we simply pursue pleasure without differentiating between types of pleasure. And indeed, we could take a very passive view of pleasure. So Robert Nozick, for example, asks us to imagine a pleasure machine, not so far dissimilar from your computer games that you play in the evenings, perhaps, where we wire ourselves up with various electrodes, and we have to imagine a control panel where you can select any type of pleasure that you want. And all you have to do is simply sit in the chair and maximize 5 Mars bars, a drink of Coca-Cola, some rap music, whatever it is you want at that moment. And Nozick points out we would consider that a very bad idea. And Mill would agree. And so he differentiates between lower pleasures, which are simply sensations perhaps of the body, and the higher intellectual pleasures which we get, for example, through education or developing the skill of playing a musical instrument. Secondly, utilitarian ethics of Bentham's can be criticised because it seems to deny people justice. In other words, we can select one person and sacrifice them quite deliberately in order to maximise the happiness of the many. And that seems to be an immoral position. And thirdly, we could say that it's very hard to calculate consequences act by act, trying to maximise the number of hedons that are involved. And so Mill comes up with a form of rule utilitarianism. So let's explain these concepts. First of all, Mill's happiness is closer to Aristotle's eudaimonia. In his essay, Mill could be described as an inconsistent utilitarian, because right at the beginning he says, there is one intrinsic good, pleasure. Therefore, he appears to agree with Bentham. But then later on in the essay he says, happiness consists in many and various pleasures, few and transitory pains, and a predominance of the active over the passive, not expecting from life more than it is capable of delivering. So we see now that he has moved way beyond a concept that's simply based on pleasure. He's saying that happiness involves activities, reminding us of Aristotle's idea of happiness coming from an activity of the soul. And he then goes on to say that expectations are involved, where we set realistic goals and determine how we're going to achieve them. Now this looks much closer to a lifetime quest, where we grow into a fulfilled life according to the goals that we set and the skills that we develop. And that is closer to Aristotle's idea of eudaimonia. And certainly when we combine it with the higher-lower pleasure distinction, it is a long way from the idea of sitting on the pleasure machine, simply playing our computer games or whatever it is all day long. Now, Mill's is also described, following J.O. Urmson in 1953, as a weak rule utilitarian. And Mill uses an example to explain this, which we don't find usually in textbooks. And the example is that of a navigator Mill says, if you go as a navigator on the sea on a ship, you take with you certain things. You take an almanac which sets out the states of the tide and the times at which the tides will change at different parts of the coast. And minimal, you take with you a chart, even if it's an electronic chart. And on a physical chart, if we were to look at one, we would find a lot of chart datum. Those are things that have been discovered about the depth of the water from the past experience of navigators who've dropped down a plumb line, or these days looked at their depth sounder, and plotted those depths on a chart for a certain state of the tide. And Mill says you'd be lunatic to ignore the wisdom of past navigators and chart plotters and people who determine the phase of the moon and the states of the tide if you go on the sea. And indeed, if you were to try to do that without those two things, as a minimum, you would end up shipwrecking your life or shipwrecking your boat. And Mill says, by analogy, exactly the same happens in our own lives. We're crazy to set off on the moral path without considering the wisdom of people who've gone before us. That may be our parents, it may be our friends who've had experiences similar to us, or it may be a very wise aunt or our grandparents. And what we would tend to do is ask those people what they would do in a very difficult situation, particularly a situation, for example, where two moral goods conflict. So we can't have it both ways. And Mill says that we navigate according to rules, such as the rule, generally always keep your promise, or the rule, generally always tell the truth. But then when we face a particular dilemma, we might revert and go back to being an apt utilitarian, because we need in that situation to assess the advantages and disadvantages in terms of maximising happiness of a certain form of action. So with Mill, we end up with a multi-level or weak rule utilitarian. We have rules that generally we navigate our lives by, but we break them when circumstances require us to exercise our reason and apply the greatest happiness principle in a unique way, perhaps, for that situation. The greatest happiness, therefore, remains the fundamental principle, but Mill interprets it in his own unique way.